For this bonus episode, we were joined by Dr. Mike, who is a therapist, podcaster, and musician. I hope that you enjoy our chat. Well, hello. Welcome to Why Not Both?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. How has everything been going? My first interview question used to be like, hey, tell people what you do because you do a bunch of stuff. And now I'm just like, how are you?
Doing okay. This is a tough time, but I think all things being equal, I can't complain. Knock on wood. People in my life are healthy and I'm able to work, so I can't complain too much. But it does take a toll.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right before we started recording, we were talking about the over zooming. Even it's so funny. Did you ever Zoom prior to this? Like, was Zoom a part of your life before this whole experience?
I don't think so. I didn't even know that they had Zoom before this, I don't think.
That's so funny. I knew about it because some of my friends used it internationally because Skype would always kind of like glitch in and out. And they were like, oh, have you heard of this thing, Zoom? And I was like, no, what is that? And so I started using it. And before all this, I'd be like, oh, just hop on Zoom. And people would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, yeah, now it's a verb.
Zoom is a verb, indeed. Like Xerox.
Exactly. What you mentioned, you're like, I can't complain. I've been doing work. And I'm curious, like, what have you been doing during this time and how has it changed?
So my primary job is as a clinical psychologist and for some people, life coach. And that hasn't changed very much, except for the fact that I do everything virtual now. I used to have offices in New York and New Jersey, but I closed both those physical spaces and I work totally remote now. Other than that, it's basically been the same. And then during the pandemic, my wife and I started an online both therapy and coaching program and media site called Hardcore Humanism. And that is in part the approach that we use for therapy and for helping people, which is based on sort of a combination of humanistic psychology with some behavioral and behavioral medicine principles. And we also launched a podcast called Hardcore Humanism to talk to people kind of like we're talking now about different aspects of their life and how, at least from our perspective, it reflects the hardcore humanism philosophy, which is a more purpose-driven life. And we found that to a large degree, interviewing musicians has been very helpful in that regard, because the main idea that we want people to do, at least what I want people to do when I'm working with them, is a lot of times in life, people will feel like everyone's telling them to go right, but they feel like going left is better for them. And they want to find their purpose. They want to work hard to achieve it and find a community to support that purpose. And whatever the going left is, like sometimes that could mean coping with mental illness. Sometimes that could be being a musician instead of being a lawyer. Sometimes it could be being a lawyer instead of being a doctor. Sometimes it could be finding a passion that you're interested in. Sometimes it could be pursuing, somebody that you care about or love, or building friendships, kind of build your social network. And whatever it may be, we want people to feel empowered to do that. And one of the things that we found was that I had developed that through some experiences of myself doing a little bit of music on my own, but then also later on talking with different musicians and interviewing them and realizing that they tended to have that pattern because, quite frankly, most people are not necessarily, like, their parents aren't thinking, well, what I really want my kid to do is to become a professional musician. And so, they often have to spend a lot of time when there's a lot of pressure for them to do something else, to pursue that, they generally find a purpose in that music. They have to work excruciatingly hard, both in terms of practicing, songwriting, touring, promoting, all of those things. And eventually, hopefully, whether it's fellow musicians, bandmates, management, or even just fans, like finding people who will support that dream. And so the goal of the podcast is really to just present as many people as possible, so that the people who are potentially fans of someone's music will listen and think like, well, I don't just enjoy their music. I kind of want to learn from their example. And, and so that what we've basically, do that. And to whatever extent it aids people in thinking that they may also want to pursue some kind of therapy or coaching, either with us or with somebody else. And later on in the pandemic, we began working with a website, Consequence of Sound, and Consequence Media on a podcast called Going There, which is a similar format where I interview musicians, but it's more focused on coping with mental illness. So people who struggle with depression or addiction, and it's similar because in the Hardcore Humanism podcast, we do have people who we struggle with mental health issues, and we do talk about that, but it's more of a personal development podcast in general, not specifically mental illness. And so, I guess there's a long-winded way of saying, what have I been doing? I've been doing what I was doing before, plus a little extra, I guess.
I was like, so many questions sparked in my brain. I was like, where to begin? I guess the first question would be, how would you break down in bite-sized chunks what humanistic psychology is to a layperson, to someone who has not studied psychology, and why did you choose the modifier hardcore for hardcore humanism?
So I think that this is all my opinion. I think people would maybe disagree on my assessment, but I think that one of the things that I've found a little bit frustrating at times about my field is that it often feels as though, whether intentionally or not, we tend to pathologize people. So there's a lot of language of unconscious conflict or cognitive distortions or irrational thinking or behavior, or biological, biochemical abnormalities. Like there's a lot of language in that vein, in terms of when it's sort of a lot of what is wrong with people. And the idea is like, well, if you're not feeling in a certain way, if you're not feeling happy or satisfied, that there must be something wrong that's broken, and we're going to try to fix it. And on the one hand, sometimes that's kind of appealing to people because they think they feel, people think of themselves as broken in some ways, and they want to feel better. But for a lot of people, that language and that approach is kind of invalidating. And I found that at least for me personally, when I practiced, it didn't work as well, because I found that for the most part, people's issues tend to be very much based in reality, and tends to be I don't see a lot of what I would consider truly irrational or distorted behavior. I see a lot of people who feel like they're kind of stuck in the weeds and need to figure out a way out. And I think that humanistic psychology was different in the sense that we don't have to necessarily change people. What we have to do is we have to clear the way so people can find their authentic self. And that, to me, that, the concept of what I believe Carl Rogers, who did Rogerian therapy, talked about as unconditional positive regard, the fact that all people have value and have worth. And our job as therapists is to figure out how to clear the way so that they can find that person. And with, theorists like Maslow, like the idea of then helping people actualize and find their best selves. Right. And so that just sort of became naturally what I found appealed to me more. And I found that, at least for me personally, as a therapist, it seemed to be working better when I was able to convey that, or I was able to do that with people, as opposed to when I wasn't, when I was more judgmental, or I was more critical, where I was more maybe judgy if you will. It did not work as well.
Got it.
And so over time, I kind of evolved into that more. And I think that in particular, people finding purpose is something that, in my opinion, is very much a key to self-actualization, to kind of understand, why are we here? What are we doing? Because, quite frankly, a lot of the things that we have to do in life don't feel great. A lot of people talk about like, oh, it feels so good to be healthy. It's like, no, it doesn't. Everything that feels good for the most part is unhealthy. Feeling healthy feels good.
Right.
But, but a lot of the things like eating healthy, like exercising a lot, not drinking, not using substances, making sure you go to bed on time. These are things that they eventually can feel good, but a lot of it are things that actually don't feel good at the time. But if you can understand why they're fitting into your greater purpose, like I'm going to bed because, I'm training for a marathon and I want to get up early in the morning and I want to do those 10 miles and I'm excited about that. Well, now all of a sudden that sacrifice actually connects into something bigger in your own life. And potentially, it's something that people with AA or recovery programs, the idea of a higher power. Well, this isn't necessarily a higher power in that way. It's almost like your own personal higher power.
Yeah.
And I think that to me, that's the humanism part. So the hardcore part comes from two places. One, it's a little bit of a nod to a hardcore punk. So one of the people that I'd interviewed for Psychology Today, someone who's always influenced me quite a bit, was Ian MacKaye of the band Minor Threat, and eventually Fugazi, who, from what I understand, gave the label hardcore punk. The idea was, well, if you're going to be punk rock, we're going to be more punk. We're going to be faster. We're going to be more independent. We're going to be more confrontational. And so we'll be hardcore punk. And so the idea was, if you're humanistic, we're going to be more humanistic. We're going to be more empathic. We're going to be more validating. We're going to be more understanding. And in particular, we're going to help you work harder to actualize. So that's where a lot of the behavioral medicine techniques come in, where we don't just want you to feel like, hey, you're authentic. We want to be like, well, if you have a purpose, we want to help you get it.
Yeah.
We just want to help you on the path to getting it. So that was where that part came from. But the other part of it came when I was in my 30s. I had basically, I think I babbled to a friend of mine that I just wanted, if I had a bucket list, I wanted to be able to sing in a band. At one point, I had a friend who took me to see her friend's band, and I think that they were a cover band, and they did like a Pearl Jam cover song, and I thought that was really cool. And I said, I just want to try to do that once in my life.
Yes.
And I went and auditioned for a band that I, just for reasons that I'm not really sure on, I thought they were all like me. They didn't really know what they were doing. But I can't sing. And so I just kind of assumed that nobody else, for some reason, that maybe they couldn't play their instruments either. But when I went in, I realized that they were like, they sounded, at least to me, like a real band. And I was so upset and embarrassed. And I actually recently interviewed Carl Bell Fuel. The first song that I tried to sing was Hemorrhage, which was a song that I really liked. And I actually told him that story. And the drummer just looked so disgusted that I realized that this wasn't going very well. And they asked me to just sing along as they jammed. And I didn't know any. I was like, I'm totally like out of my league here. And so what happened was, I started towards the end of about after a half hour or so, I got so upset that I actually just started screaming into the microphone. And I left, and like a nerd that I am, I wrote I wrote a thank you note to the person who invited me to the audition. And they called me up and they said, well, we were going to do an alternative band, but with your voice, like I was thinking maybe like a thrash or a hardcore band would make more sense. And I just said, I'm so sorry. Like, I actually don't know what those words mean. Like what, like a thrash hardcore band? Like, is this some kind of like blood porn or something? I honestly, like I wasn't
what's happening here.
Yeah. And I was just like, I was just kind of like, to be honest, I think you're just making up words. Yeah. And so then when I heard some of it and I was like, oh, this does sound actually a little bit more like me. And then when we played for about 10 years in a band together, and what was interesting was that there were these people that I had grown up with who were into metal and were into punk or alternative in some ways, and they were all black and they had makeup on, or they had these crazy t-shirts that said things like Iron Maiden or like Black Sabbath, or and they had piercings, and they, to be honest, like they were somewhat frightening to me, and it wasn't the world that I was in. And then when I stepped into that world and I started dressing more like that, I found two things that happened. One was that a lot of the world wasn't very kind about it. A lot of people were. It almost felt like my world separated into two groups, where it was like people who either were just supportive because I was doing something different or actually liked what we were doing. And then people who were kind of like, oh my God, like, what are you
doing?
You're dressing all in black and you're like, you already shaved your head and you're screaming and you're writhing around on the floor. And it was just, and are you okay emotionally? And the thing was that I had actually never felt better, quite frankly. Right. And what I soon found was that all of these people who I had sort of dismissed, as I think much of society has, as being something between a ne'er-do-well and dangerous, were actually the people who were particularly open-minded, particularly kind, particularly talking about in their music and in their lives issues that other people wouldn't touch. So, anything from, if you want to, anything from Black Sabbath's War Pigs to Ozzy's Crazy Train to, and, on and on and on to Mark Greenway of Napalm Death. And it just, all of these, the whole hardcore movement, Mackay. And so what happened was that I had discovered that all of a sudden these were people that were very humanistic, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. And later on, I had started for Popular Press, I had started interviewing people and musicians, and I just started to find that more and more that I learned about those subcultures, in addition to playing or being involved with them just from my own musical perspective, the more I just discovered that that's been part of it all along. I just didn't know. Right. And so the hardcore humanism was also a nod to whether or not it's hardcore or metal or hip hop, like these subgenres that have been to some degree labeled as dangerous. I wanted to kind of give a nod to the humanistic element of them. So it was sort of the humanism of hardcore. I couldn't call it metal humanism, hip hop humanism. So I just felt hardcore humanism. Right. I had to have one name basically. So it was, I love that. And so that was really the other piece of it, was that I wanted people, at least to whatever extent anyone was paying attention, to recognize that I saw something in this world. And what I felt like was, to be honest, I don't think I'm all that relevant to that world in terms of any kind of centrality to it. But for anyone who was paying attention, I think that to realize that I had not been in that world. Mm-hmm. I had studied psychology, and in theory, like I'm supposed to be this person who's, working on health and well-being and all that kind of stuff and knows how to feel good and all that kind of stuff. But I was not necessarily. I found it in this world, and they kind of took me beyond where I would have imagined going in terms of thinking about the world and thinking about human nature and thinking about the things that are both right and wrong. And that to me was just my little, I just wanted to kind of say there's a humanistic element to this, that if anyone's interested and you can just pay attention,
Yeah.
and maybe like me, you'll find something that you didn't expect to find.
That's fascinating that you noted that it appeared dangerous to be open-minded and actualize, that we perceive that as danger in a way.
Well, I think at the original time, I think I was just looking at people's appearance and the fact that the music was so intense.
Yeah.
But later, I think it's interesting that you say that, because what I found was that people, whether or not, anything from, again, just being willing to say you have a mental illness, to people who are coming out as gay or transitioning in terms of gender, or willing to, get out of an abusive relationship, it's just what you said, that open-mindedness, that willingness to do something different is very frightening. And I think what a lot of people find is that being themselves authentically just simply does not work in their world. And there's a lot of damage that gets done to people, unfortunately, when they're in situations that don't foster that sense of openness, don't foster that sense of authenticity, and perhaps even reject people, because of that. And I think you see a lot of that in, not as much anymore, but when I was growing up, people who would wear, metal out, like something like, long hair with a denim jacket, and, kind of stereotypical like metalhead would talk about getting beaten up. People who were in hardcore would get beaten up all the time, at least by at least by their own report. And so that's why I think that a lot of people from those worlds, from my perspective, have a lot more to say about therapy and just sort of human development than they're given credit for. Although I will say this, that they are given credit by their fans, because a lot of people will say, well, music saved my life.
Right.
For everyone that's got a therapist saved their life, there's probably 10 people that say that music has saved their life. And there's a reason for that. There's just something about it that we connect to. But I even find that with actors or athletes. I mean, I think there's all different versions of that, but music's always been special to me. So I think I kind of keyed in on that for that reason.
Well, and in some ways, it seems like it's almost threatening to some people when others find their purpose. And I was mulling over, I was like, do people fear that they're not actualizing? Do they fear that maybe if they haven't found their purpose, if someone else does, that they're just like, well, I want that and I don't have it, so I'll just be mad at them.
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is that a purpose-driven individual is harder to control. Yeah. And I think is harder to, it's in some ways, I think, I think a lot of people fear disconnection. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that's tough is that what a lot of people don't realize is that if you'd allow someone to be their authentic selves, the connection you probably have will be a lot better and a lot deeper and a lot more meaningful. But there's also a risk that somebody that they're just, people won't connect as much, whether that's parents to kids or spouses or friends, or even within music. There's a lot of times musicians will talk about, quote unquote, like going solo because they want to, they don't feel like their artistic vision is expressed in a band, and so I think that it's a lot of people, I think, are just afraid. To be honest, I think the biggest thing is that people are just afraid of losing that person in some way. And it's frightening, especially if the person's important to you. And so sometimes I think we do things that are unfortunately damaging to the people we love just because we don't want to lose them.
Yeah. And in a way, kind of internalizing that in ourselves. Like, I enjoyed that you said that you interviewed musicians so that their fans could hear about what they went through to kind of summon the strength to kind of go against maybe what the dominant narrative is in society of what you should be. Because like it is constantly a struggle, because do you find that at all, like being someone in multiple fields, do you ever have a voice in your head that's like, oh, why are you doing this thing? I thought you were doing that other thing. Aren't you supposed to do this one thing?
Yeah, I think that's, I think one thing that's positive now is that I think there are fewer people who would say that.
Yeah.
But I still think, yeah, that's predominant. But I think that one of the really nice things that's happening now on a societal level is you're seeing more and more people appreciating the multi-dimensional nature of human beings, and not feeling as though they have to reject something just because they don't understand it, or that they even have to understand it. Like, so it's like, I don't, like, I don't know why you are, someone's really into playing guitar, but then is also super into math. Like, but I think there's a lot of people, like in the math metal world that would actually, like, say, actually, it makes total sense, and so, hopefully as time goes on, those boundaries will be broken. I think that people will feel more, as there are more examples out there of people living more authentically, and then people can learn about them. They can say, oh, I can do X and Y. This is not a dichotomy. This is only a dichotomy in other people's eyes, but this is me,
Right.
whatever me happens to be.
Right. And especially as we see more expressions of that, because if you don't see examples of it, it's hard to like kind of imagine yourself in that position if you don't see someone else doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, a lot of times what, they'll say sometimes with adolescents, they just need one thing to kind of grab onto that they can believe in. And I think that, a lot of times it's people who they don't know. It's musicians, it's actors, it's athletes, someone who is doing something that they can, that the only thing they know for sure is that it matters to them. Like I couldn't really explain to you why music matters to me. I just know that since I was a kid, I know that as soon as I started hearing music and I had any control over listening to it, like I would put on my parents' records or whatever,
Mhm.
I knew that it was something that mattered to me. And just the ability to feel like you're connected to something, even for a little bit of time, I think can be very valuable to people, especially when they feel disconnected in other ways.
Oh. Yeah, and that when you were talking about purpose, a few things went through my mind. Like first was like Viktor Frankl's book, like Man's Search for Meaning, that it's like without that sense of purpose in the story of our lives, we perish. And so it's important to have kind of like your own through thread, um, whatever that may be. But then I was
Yeah.
that through thread doesn't have to always be to one singular purpose. Like if your purpose, if you feel that music is what connects you, it sounds like then that thread got interwoven into psychology, and then into podcasting, and then into coaching, and then into like it is a theme that's running through there, but it's not like we're only focused on music.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm pretty sure that I'm going to butcher Franco, so I might run into a little trouble here. But one of the things that I've always tried to encourage people to make the distinction between is meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, meaning is something like, for example, a lot of the more meaning-based therapies are done in people who are in hospice from something like cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's wonderful in that circumstance for people to be able to kind of make sense of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And especially during times when they may not be able to make other changes.
Oh.
But to me, meaning has always been sort of it's active in the sense that it's thought-wise active, but it's often retrospective in a way. It's kind of like taking where you are and finding meaning in it.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, and this may be an artificial distinction. I'm certainly, I don't know Frankel's work well enough to know whether or not that was a distinction that they made, but that he made was, but to me, purpose is more action oriented. It's more organizing moving forward.
Gotcha.
And so, I think it's great to find meaning in things after the fact, but I think it's if there's a possibility, I think it's even more powerful to find purpose moving forward, because that can help you orient. And again, this may be an artificial distinction that I'm the only one who makes in my head, but whenever I hear people talk about meaning or see the effectiveness of meaning-based therapies, it makes sense to me where it's effective. And I do think, from what I've seen, it's a very promising approach. But the part, that I would just kind of encourage people is meaning is wonderful, but purpose is a little bit more. I think you could potentially do more with that if you put your purpose into action effectively.
That's fascinating, as a person who I experienced time blindness pretty much.
Mm.
So, so I'm just like, welp, the present moment, and here we are.
Yeah.
I hadn't conceptualized meaning as almost like retrospective and purpose driven as future facing.
Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I interrupted you.
I was just like, that is my conversational style. Do not fret. Yeah, like I find that, I guess in the simplest of terms, I get my dopamine during the process. So if the process is not meaningful, I'm not invested in it. Like if I don't have a story of why it's interesting, like, because the purpose like does exist in my mind, but it's a bit foggy. I don't quite know where it is. It's not like my spatial abilities, which are great. My time abilities are a little hazy. And so if I'm thinking only, for instance, for a long-term goal, I might not actually be motivated to do something because my brain's not going to chain those things together.
Yeah. And I think the way that I see it, and if you look at almost anything anyone does, take this podcast as an example, right? Yeah. Or, like, let's say people who are interested in religion, or meditation or exercise or school or really anything that we use as some kind of purpose-driven journey. Yeah. What it usually involves is, at the beginning, taking some kind of big picture view of something that you have decided matters to you or is going to be helpful for you, and setting up the structure of how you would pursue that. But once you've done that, it's more about being in the moment. Yeah. So for example, like if you're at school and let's say that you want to be a medical doctor, it's great for you to, when you're in high school, be like, okay, so I want to, really take science classes, and I want to go someplace where they have a strong, maybe it's pre-med, a strong science program so that I can do well for the MCATs, whatever. And I want to apply to school, and then I want to apply to med school. Each of these times you're kind of being a part of this bigger program, but it's not going to work if every time you're studying for a test, you're like, oh my God, if I don't do well on this, I have to be a doctor. I have to be a doctor. Like, right. You have to be in the moment. But those two things to me work very synergistically. Like the structure protects the moment. Right. So the purpose-driven structure, knowing that, like, so for both you and I, we both have podcasts. So like we have decided at some point that there's something about the overall structure of a podcast and the purpose of a podcast that matters to us. Once that's protected in our minds, once that's settled and we've set up how we're going to do it, now we can just go about the nitty gritty of doing the podcast. The thing. I think if you have one but not the other, so for example, like I think it's great to move, but if all you're caring about is movement, that's one thing. But if you want to have like results from a health perspective, right, it's important to at least take a little bit of time to figure out, like, okay, what are you, like you said, there's movement, there's eating, but then at some point you want it to be kind of more intuitive and kind of more natural and try to connect with yourself. But if you have all forward thinking and nothing in the moment, like you said, it's not going to work. But if you have nothing forward thinking, right, everything's just in the moment, like it might, and some people, like for some people that works. I always get frustrated when people talk, like I feel like sometimes people in my field will talk about being in the moment, like it kind of takes it too far, because it's sort of like, it's like there are people who have, and I'm not thinking of anyone specifically, just to be clear, like, like who have studied and learned meditation and set up a whole program, and like it has, and you pay for it, and there are lessons or whatever. And then it's like, okay, now all we have to do is just be in the moment. Don't think about the future. It's like, but in order to get to that point, you have to think a lot beyond the moment,
right,
to get to that point, to be in the moment. And I sometimes I feel like it gets lost in the translation when people are explaining that, like, being mindful and being present is not something that has to be antithetical to, because as human beings, we have the ability. That's one of the advantages that we have in theory in the animal kingdom, is that we have forward thinking abilities.
Metacognition, it's great.
Yeah. And so you don't want to say that, like, oh, well, forward thinking is not in the moment, because that's part of my moment. Like, part of my moment when I'm with my kids is thinking about their future. Like that's in the moment for me. And people can say, well, no, you have to be in the moment. It's like, yeah, thanks. But, if you don't mind, I'm going to worry about my kid a little bit, and you can either worry about your kid or not, but this is my kid. So I'm actually thinking about whether or not they have food for next week.
That's,
so,
I appreciate that on behalf of your kids. I'm like, snacks are important.
Yeah. Snacks are so important.
It's that fine line between, do I hate everything or am I just hungry?
There's no fine line. Snacks are important. Period. Exclamation point.
You're like, that is the
end of discussion. I'm open-minded about everything, but not that.
But not about that.
Not about snacks.
I was about to ask, like, how would you define your purpose? I'm like, maybe your purpose is snacks. I was like, overall, like, how would you define the purpose that you bring, or the purpose that you're seeking in these different activities, especially during this time?
Well, the way that I try to encourage people to think about it is not that there's like one singular purpose, as much as there's a series of of different aspects of a purpose. And so the way that and then sometimes there are sort of tenets or general themes that run through all of them. So for example, like in some martial arts training, like when I trained in Taekwondo, there was sort of the tenets of Taekwondo, that like things like courtesy and integrity and perseverance that you might carry through all of the things that you're doing. But as an example, like the way that I like to encourage people to do it is just start with what it is that you notice makes you either happy, sad, fulfilled, empty, angry, whatever. And just notice what those things are. You know what I mean? So for example, if it bothers you that you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you have high blood pressure or you have high blood sugar, then it's almost like the way that I would kind of look at it. It's almost like an entrepreneur who's kind of like saying, well, like, let's open up a project here. Like if some people like working for a company that sells stuff, it's like, well, let's open up a project here about how we can make, this product and it could address these needs, so let's open up a health folder, a little bit. If health matters enough to you that what the doctor says bothers you, right, then let's sort of look at it as something that might be important for you all the way through. So what we always say to people is you want your ambitions and your actions and your evaluations to all line up. So in other words, like if you want something, like you want to be healthy, right, you want your actions to do that. And then how you evaluate yourself then is based on that ambition. And so sometimes people will not go through that whole process. And so they'll say, well, I started out wanting to be healthy, but then, and I ate healthy and I moved around a little bit, but now I'm evaluating myself based on how much I weigh only. And if I'm not thin, then I'm not happy. It's like, well, wait, you didn't start with thin.
Right.
You started with healthy.
Right.
And your actions were healthy, but now you're evaluating yourself based on thin. And I'm not judging one way or another whether or not that's appropriate or inappropriate goal, but that's when I think about purpose, I think about in all areas of your life. Basically, so usually there's about 4 things. There's like being productive in some ways. So like having for some people that's having a career. For some people that's doing things in their house. There's sometimes helping the community, whatever it is, that's kind of like that's productive action.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be multiple things. That's one type of purpose. Then there's usually connection to other people. And that could be romantic, that could be friends, that could be being part of a broader community. And those are all parts of one's purpose. And then there's usually like a health and wellness, like how do you want to feel? Sometimes for people, it's how they want to look, it's how they want to live longer. There's that whole thing. And then sometimes there's like a passion or an interest or something like that. And, I just encourage people to say, like, just have as many different aspects to your purpose as possible.
Yeah.
And then think about, well, what would the actions be and how would you evaluate it? And then figure out, how does this all fit into one life? And that's where it can get very complicated for people. So, for example, like if all I cared about was productive, like professional actions, I would work 90, 100 hours a week. I would not sleep very much. I would, I would sleep enough to be able to be coherent, but,
right.
and I might really see my professional, achievements soar, but I also have personal goals. I also have health goals. I also have things I'm passionate about. So now all of a sudden I have to start figuring out, like, how do I balance all those things?
Yeah.
But what I encourage people to do is to figure that out in theory ahead of time and look at like their daily and weekly and monthly schedules and think like, well, if you want to be healthy and you do the following things within reason, would you be healthy? And if the answer is yes, be like, okay, that's good. Now you want to have romantic relationships or you want to foster a marriage or something like that. It's like, okay, well, what do you have to do for that?
Right.
And they start putting all those things together. And then you start seeing like, oh, do I have time for all of this? And what has to be pulled back a little bit? How do I adjust, certain sense of purpose and certain ambitions? And that's where I think, again, a lot of people will struggle because they want it all. They don't really think ahead of time that they can't get it all. And then they judge themselves because they don't have it all.
Right. Right.
And that's where it gets kind of ugly emotionally.
Well, and how did you find you balanced all of those things during this time, particularly when you said, like, especially with the change with doing all of this from home and with balancing all the things you do, like, how did you kind of troubleshoot that for yourself in this situation?
Oh, I didn't. I went everywhere. Like I mean, and that's something I'm honest with people about. Like they, a purpose-driven life is not a linear life, oftentimes. And, I was very happy because I was able to be at home. I wasn't commuting 3 hours a day anymore. And that was wonderful. And I was also I was happy as, see my wife more, I see my kids more. I was very happy that my wife and I launched Hardcore Humanism together. And I was very, very thrilled with that. I was thrilled we were doing a podcast. Yeah. And I was thrilled we got invited to do another podcast. And I was not thrilled with, I think a lot of people were suffering emotionally, but I was glad that I was able to help in terms of my, from a business perspective. Like I enjoy working with people. And all of that was going wonderfully. But then one day I just all of a sudden realized that I was working all the time. I was never going, I wouldn't go outside for days.
Yeah.
And I was not being healthy. I was definitely eating too many bad foods and not moving around as much, not getting outside as much, not resting enough, not sleeping enough. And so that was, to me, was a perfect example of where all of the things in my life, for the most part, that mattered to me, really, were firing on all cylinders in a way that they hadn't before, in a good way.
Yeah.
I'd spent 15 years not commuting into work. This was a dream come true, and I just kept shoving more and more things that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I've always been willing to sacrifice my health and well-being to do certain things. But when I was younger, I could kind of get away with it. But I'm older now, and I can't. And that I needed a couple of months ago to sort of just be like, whoa, like something's gotta change. And so the way that I kind of try to keep it all together is I try to keep in mind and sometimes, like for me, like I have like a list of the things that are my purpose of what I have to do. And sometimes I'm better with really paying attention to it every day. And sometimes I lose track. And sometimes, quite frankly, when I lose track and this is, a lot of people who I've worked with who talk about drug and alcohol use will talk about it this way, which is that for some people, drug and alcohol use comes from a very dark place. But there's a lot of people that the dark place emerges because people are just really enjoying their lives. Like a lot of musicians have talked about, like, we were partying and it was so much fun. And then just one day you wake up and you're like, oh, a beer in the morning would feel a little bit better,
Right.
And that wasn't a bad thing. Like, you're having an amazing time. Like, you're out on the road, like, this is great. And all of a sudden you're just, I don't know how I wandered into this. And that was not, obviously I don't want to compare, what I went through to somebody who was struggling with addiction, but it was similar in the way that it was kind of a blind side.
Yeah.
It was
kind of like flight into productivity. Like you're using that productivity in a way, like you're describing like a drug or alcohol, that you're like, well, it makes me feel good, so I guess I'll do a little more of this.
And it was, I think that it was just more, it was, and I also think like it was a little bit tough. I think something I didn't give a lot of credit for was that things that I liked to do. So for example, I like, up until the pandemic, I like doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu. That was something that I'd found a school that I really liked here, and I've been training for a while. And I would take my kids in New York. There's A7, which is now Niagara, had these Sunday matinee shows that were all ages for hardcore punk shows. And I would take my kids, and we would go, and it was great because it was like people were there, and it was wild, and it was crazy, everything that you want from those experiences. And my son I originally brought, and my daughter I brought to ones later, actually outdoor ones for the pandemic. And it was wonderful. And all of a sudden those were two things that I didn't feel comfortable doing anymore. And so all of a sudden, like I had these other things, like I was home more, which was great. And I had these things that I was doing, but I didn't kind of pay attention to the fact that there were these other things that I really loved doing,
Right.
that I just wasn't doing. I was kind of like, oh, I'll get back to them and whatever. And,
Right.
and I hope I will at some point, but that's what I try to explain to people, is that, the stuff can sneak up on you. Yeah. And, and I think that's why it's wonderful. Excuse me. It's wonderful to have purpose, but you have to look at all of the different, aspects of your purpose, and you just sort of pay attention. Like some people, when they're working all the time, actually it works out great. They're not as concerned with relationships, not as concerned with their health. And it's like, great. But, I wanted all those things, and I had to adjust myself accordingly.
Yeah, this feels very spy versus spy, because like I'm a licensed MFT, and so I've been doing the same thing during the pandemic as you.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh yes, I get this vibe. But finding someone who understands your blind spots is so key, because even if you have all the knowledge, I'll never forget one of my partners said to me something really funny, that I had like a fear response to something, and I recognized I was having a fear response and was doing things to calm myself down. And he's like, well, why, if you know what's happening, like, why, if you understand it, are you still having this reaction? And I was like, well, I still live in a human body. Like, I was like, sadly, I have not been able to escape the meat suit. So I was like,
It was only that easy.
right. I was just like, so sadly, my cognitive abilities are useless right now. So we're just doing a good like calming of the vagus nerve and a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I was like, we'll get out of this. We know what it is.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting that he was like, and he wasn't saying it to be offensive. He was saying out of genuine curiosity, if you understand what's going on, like why can't you like get yourself out of this? Um,
Yeah.
and so I found at least that it's so important to have people in that role in my life because I find that potentially people in our fields can have um, accidental self myopia, I guess.
Well said. Well, it's I mean, it's one of the places where we're most myopic is like you would never say to somebody, well, you know, you have diabetes, so why don't you have it under control? It's like, well, it's like, yeah, I know I have diabetes, which means I know that there are certain things that I need to do or can't do in order to manage that. And that's the way it is with anxiety. That's the way it is with depression. That's the way it is with addiction. And I think as a society, it's still hard for us. And I think some of it comes down to the language because, being depressed is not having depression. Being anxious is not having an anxiety disorder. And, being obsessive is not having OCD. And I think part of the language is that I think, while I do think that there's a continuum in a lot of ways, I think that there's a, like, yeah, you can, if you're a little bit sad, kind of snap out of it if you decide that that's what you want to do. I don't really recommend that, nor do I really endorse that in people because I think we should listen to ourselves. But so when you're like someone says that to you, it's like, why don't you, if you understand it, it's like, yeah, understanding it's the beginning,
Right.
it's not the end.
Like, exactly. And it's fascinating to me that you turn to musicians in a way to teach these lessons, like as a fellow musician myself as well. And that also both of us have chosen to, in a way, go into what one would say is like a different career path than music. However, I've always advocated that whether you choose a career path that's in the art that you are passionate about, that doesn't invalidate then your passion for the art. I've always found it really odd that we have to like monetize or make something like that. You're like, oh, you're not actually interested in this if it's not your quote job.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually one of the books that really influenced me a lot was American Hardcore by Stephen Blush. And one of the things that he talked about, and I've talked with him a couple of times, is that part of what hardcore punk was about was by redefining success in non-monetary terms.
Right.
And I think that a lot of the more of the subcultures, as opposed to more mainstream culture, by definition, mainstream culture is defined by mainstream acceptance, and typically with that comes a certain amount of mainstream success and if you're lucky, mainstream money. But I think that I agree with you. Like I don't think it's necessary, in fact, to have a passion. So in fact, for some people, they would say that disconnecting your art from a financial need is actually a more powerful way of making sure that it stays authentic for you. Yeah. I understand that there are some people that, and I would not count myself among those, who are, for lack of a better way of saying it, so gifted with both like bursting ideas and like the ability to pursue those ideas that it becomes almost a kind of thing where I just can't do anything else. Like I really just need to do this. And yeah. I think that's where I think a lot of the people who we see out in the world are like that. Yeah. And if that's you, then that's, quite frankly, that's a little bit different and a little bit more complicated. Yeah. But if at some point you feel like it's not bursting out of you in that way, where you actually have room and space for other things, I'm not saying that people should necessarily get a quote unquote day job, but I would just look to the examples of some people in hardcore hip hop or other, there's a lot of people who are even prominent artists now who have side gigs that they do, that still make very important art. And so I would just just realize, like, again, there's all kinds of ways of pursuing your various passions. You don't have to do it in one way.
Yes, I'm all about kind of breaking down in a way like the archetype of an artist, that it's like you must be monofocused, you must suffer, like all these things. I'm like, do you though?
A lot of people do.
I was like, we all kind of suffer anyway. Like, do you got to go extra hard just to be an artist?
A lot of the times, I think, unfortunately.
They're like, yeah, sometimes. Monofocus is fascinating to me because I've 0% understood it throughout my life personally. And so I've always had this, like, I'm really passionate about these 7 things. And people are like, the 7 things? But yeah, all 7 of them. Like, we're going into all of them. And having examples of people both who are monofocused, but also who do passionately pursue, say, the 7 things.
Yeah. And one of the examples from when I was growing up that I always point to with the people I'm working with is Eddie Murphy. When Eddie Murphy came out and he was doing, stand up, and he did SNL, and then he did movies, and all of a sudden he came out with Party All the Time. He started doing music. And I think he received a lot of, even though I think it's a great song, Rick James is involved. I think the song was great and it stood the test of time as far as I'm concerned. But a lot of people were kind of like, oh, this is a what's that they call it? What's that, like an ego project or something? There's a term for it now. I'm forgetting what it is. A vanity project. And he did that. He did a few other things, but then, if you sort of notice, like, I think that his ability to be a musician on his own was what set him up for, I think was it Dreamgirls, where he won his Golden Globe? Was that the name of the movie?
I know that was the name of the movie, but I don't remember if that was.
It was
my brain.
The one with Jamie. It was the one with Jamie Foxx and Beyonce. I don't know.
I'm like, I have 0 idea if those things are related, but I'm also willing to completely believe you.
I'm just going to look this up.
It's one of those things where I'm like, I could Google it.
I'm going to do that right now. It was Dreamgirls, and he won a Golden Globe, and he saw his James Brown or his Michael Jackson impressions, and you saw something where throughout. And obviously this is all in entertainment and whatever. So some people would say it's not that, but that's a perfect example of where there's somebody who, even with being an open creative person, even with being successful, there were a lot of people like, oh, why are you doing that? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But I would and in his case, I think it worked out great because it was his greatest acting moment, based, some people would say, and it got him a lot of praise. And I think, that was, what, like 30 years later or 40 years later, like, or something like that, maybe 30 years later. And I would just encourage people to say, like, look, if you have, like you're saying, you have multiple things that you're interested in, don't judge it. Like, people, like, we don't have, I remember my jujitsu teacher said something. He said, when you see 2 white belts rolling, it looks like they're having an argument. When you see 2 black belts rolling, it looks like they're having a conversation. And I feel like that's kind of what happens with people. It's like we have arguments with ourselves. We have beat downs with ourselves. We don't have conversations with ourselves. And we're not curious, we're critical.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, if you have something that seems a little bit like you can't pick it together, just be like, oh, it's kind of interesting. Like, I wonder why I'm interested in that. I wonder why that's something I'm spending my time doing instead of this. And just kind of talk to yourself and listen to yourself rather than judge yourself. I think you'd be surprised at, like, where you might wind up.
I think that's fantastic advice, to just remain curious.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for being so generous with your time today. I really appreciated talking to you.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate what you're doing, and this is great. And I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Why Not Both.
If you liked what you heard, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, both on Instagram and on Twitter. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. Under the Radar is a nationally distributed print, music, and entertainment magazine and website. You can find them at www.undertheradarmag.com and feel free to support them on Patreon. Extra special thanks to our producer, Laura Studeris, who is literally a rock star. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next episode.